From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead for you today, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about the merits of soil testing tame pastures and hay fields this fall, getting a read on soil pH levels in particular, which can be instrumental in grass and forage productivity. Also today, a segment of this week's Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. Bob Larson, Brad White, and Dustin Pendell will discuss vaccination programs for replacement heifers and feeder cattle purchasing decisions, among other things. And further ahead this week's K-State Horticulture segment, where Jared Hoyle will look at winterizing the home lawn with herbicide and fertilizer applications. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Good to have you aboard once again. Well, we are rounding out the growing season, of course, in Kansas, and this would be an excellent opportunity these next few weeks for those of you who are concerned about the nutrient availability to your hay fields and your tame pasture to see what needs to be done to correct any deficiencies there. And joining us once more, Nutrient Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, over from the Department of Agronomy at K-State, to lend some thoughts on this. Well, Dorivar, we routinely talk about testing fields for crop productivity, wheat, row crops, and so forth. Here's something that producers might want to give due consideration to, you say.
Yes, in the case of pasture and forage in general, there are some differences in terms of sampling and guidelines for fertilizer application. And like you mentioned, this is an excellent time of the year to be thinking about soil sampling for these systems. And it gives us opportunity to know what's the nutrient and needs, for example, lime, pH status, and make some corrective measures moving forward in the spring next year.
Just to point out, in the case of a pasture or a hay meadow, testing every year really isn't that necessary.
No,
right?
It's not. That's an excellent point. And we typically, for a system like this, we tend to talk about 3 to 4 years is a good time frame that we tend to use. And so, again, unless there are some issues, perhaps some symptoms or something happening in parts of the field that we want to find out, then we can do a more frequent sampling. But typically, for monitoring and corrective applications, we talk about 3 to 4 years time frame.
Well, let's talk procedure here. Is taking a sample for this purpose different from that for, say, a crop field?
Yes, in many ways it could be different. And one of the main differences we need to highlight here is the sampling depth. Because, of course, again, if we are talking about P&K or in the case of P&K, actually, we want to follow a similar sampling depth of 6 inches, which will be similar to what we do in crop fields. But if we're talking about lime in particular, and in this case, when we're applying lime, we're going to be broadcast on the surface. We're not going to incorporate. So we really care about what happened in the upper 3 inches or so. So in that case, we're talking about different sampling depths for pH, like I say, about 3 inches. Then other nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, we want to collect 6-inch sampling depth for those nutrients.
And you strongly urge that producers use a soil probe as opposed to, say, a shovel or spade.
Yes, and in terms of sampling procedure, of course, using a soil probe tends to be better in terms of taking care of some of the potential variabilities. We want to make sure and collect multiple subsamples. That's very important in this case. Of course, we do know, especially in graze systems, we do have a lot of small-scale variability introduced by cattle and so on in the field. So we want to make sure and take care of that variability. So the best way to do that is really to take multiple course, multiple subsamples. And we typically say at least 15 to 20 subsamples is what we want to collect in about 10-acre field. That usually tends to take care of some of the small-scale variability. And again, using a soil probe tends to be a much better option. However, if there's we don't have a soil probe available, we can always use a shovel. Basically following similar approach in terms of trying to collect uniform, consistent sampling depth. Again, we're still talking about 6 inches in the case of P and K, and if we're looking at pH, then we're talking about 3 inches. But consistency in that sampling depth. We also want to make sure in that sample that we collect with the shovel will be uniform in terms of collecting the same amount of sample in the upper layers versus the lower layers. In other words, we don't want to basically collect more samples deeper or a shallow sample that will basically dilute perhaps the nutrients and affect your nutrient concentration. So again, in the case of using a shovel for soil sampling, it is a good approach, but we just have to be a little bit more careful in terms of collecting more representative samples. Those are some things that we can avoid basically by using a soil probe.
So sample uniformity, it's essential here before you turn that sample in for analysis. Soil pH is such a key here, and that's especially important, you point out, when we look at such a crop as alfalfa, if in fact you have a stand that is not performing up to your standards.
Yes, that's an excellent point, and we do have some of those issues that we see sometimes. Alfalfa may not be producing the way we will expect, and oftentimes pH tends to be one of those limiting factors because we're talking about a legume that is especially sensitive to low pH situations. That's typically one of the first parameters I would like to evaluate in an alfalfa field. And in the case of alfalfa, again, the target pH tends to be a little bit higher because it is a legume, and we typically tends to talk to closer to about 7 pH, so almost a neutral pH is what we require for an alfalfa field. So again, this is something that's very important. In the case of grass species, we can have a little bit lower pH. However, we still need to have close to an optimum, which range around 6 to 7 in some cases. So again, that's key factor to keep in mind. On the other hand, also, if we are thinking about lime application, if we have a result that recommend lime application, we do need to think ahead in terms of when we're going to be perhaps planting alfalfa or what's the time frame that we have. And we typically talk about around 6 months, at least 6 months for that lime basically to react and change that soil pH. So we do need to think ahead in terms of lime application and keep in mind the time that's going to be required for that soil to basically change that pH. And again, from that standpoint, this could be an excellent time to collect samples, make applications, and basically be ready for the next season.
As far as that time frame in putting down that lime, one might be a little bit more selective about the product they're putting down, or at least the content of that product that maybe could speed up that absorption process.
Yes, and that's an excellent point about lime in particular. When we say that, when we talk about the time requirement to for that reaction to happen, again, we typically say 6 months or up to 12 months in some cases, and that's typically tends to be a function of the fineness of that lime material and how reactive that lime material is. In addition to soil moisture and what's happening in the field as well. So if we want to speed up that process using a higher quality lime, a more fine, more pure lime source, that can help us to improve that process, and we can see in many cases that reaction happening in the first 3 or 4 months in many cases. So again, it is certainly a function of the source of lime, but again, for a typical lime source that we will use around 50% ECC, then we typically talk about 6 months time frame.
All right. Well, we're again speaking about largely tame pastures or legumes such as alfalfa and the pH balance that you need to have the highest productivity there. We don't talk about native pastures hardly at all when it comes to sampling. Is there any cause or need to take a look at the nutrient availability there, Dorivar?
In the case of native pasture, it's typically a system that is not very responsive to fertilizer application, and that's for obvious reasons. This is a system that developed basically with limited nutrient content in the soil, and it's very efficient at using some of those basically accessing source of phosphorus. And again, we don't see that level of response typically with native pastures. And in many cases, actually, that could be, for example, adding too much nitrogen could be a concern because we can have invasive species moving in, responding to that nitrogen application. So in that case, again, we don't see the critical need that we typically do see in other systems. However, it's still a good practice to monitor, again, every 3 or 4 years levels and see if there are other concerns perhaps that we can have in those fields, not just related specifically to nitrogen and other nutrients, but perhaps other potential soil limitations.
Very good. Once again, your local extension office can help you as far as submitting samples to the K-State Soil Testing Laboratory to check on that pH and how it may impact your hay meadows, your tame grasses, as well as your legume stands out there. Before we let you go, it's a great time, too, as harvest will eventually wind down, Dorivar, to sample for new row crop nutrient needs next year.
Yes, this is important to highlight. Of course, it's an excellent time also to be thinking about row crops for next year. And in our case, at the Soil Testing Lab at K-State, we've been seeing a little bit lower volumes of soil coming in, and I think that's due to what you just mentioned in terms of harvest is basically delay, and we still a little bit delay also in soil sampling. So definitely a good time to be thinking about that once we finish harvesting. A lot of the challenges could be similar: phosphorus, potassium, pH. We need to keep those in mind, and again, what crops we're going to be planting next year.
Be planning to take care of that task likewise here as you wrap up your harvest. And again, inquire at your local extension office with any further questions about fall soil testing in the case we've talked up today for hay meadows and pasture. And we appreciate the word right here, Dorivar. Thank you.
Thank you.
He's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, Nutrient Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And you're tuned in to Agriculture Today. We'll return after this break over the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Tuned to Agriculture Today, and next up, another roundtable talk about cow-calf management for the season, a segment from the latest Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. The BCI crew this week, veterinarians Bob Larson and Brad White, and livestock economist Dustin Pendell, as they'll hit upon a trio of topics of current interest to you producers, including follow-up remarks on something they first addressed last week. Here's Brad.
One of the topics that we discussed last week was replacement heifers, and we talked a lot about rate of gain, how to get the right weight on those heifers as they go forward. What we didn't talk about is, as I wean those heifers this fall, what should our health management plan look like?
Well, as the veterinarian and one of the veterinarians in the group, one of the things that we really think about is the vaccines that we give heifers. And what we're really trying to do is prepare their immune system so that they're ready to be an adult. And this is really an important time frame. They're old enough that their immune system is basically fully mature.
So old enough being 5 to 7 months typically is what we
6 months or more really are going to respond to the vaccines well. We think a vast majority of them, but they're not a wise old cow that's been around the world and been exposed to a lot of things, so they haven't been exposed to some of the germs that they're going to see as an adult. And so a vaccine program at this time is really important. I would say work closely with your veterinarian, but your veterinarian is probably going to recommend something along some of the viral diseases that cause both respiratory disease and abortion in cows, like IBR, and BVD. Those are going to be key components of a vaccine program, as well as some of the bacteria that can cause some abortion losses, such as leptospirosis or lepto and Vibrio. Those are going to be, I think, in any vaccination program for replacement heifers. And
probably a little bit later. I mean, so as we look at weaning, and you're thinking of
really
weaning
all the way
to pre-breeding to preg-check, and so we're going to include those at some point, but some of those won't necessarily be at weaning. Depends on your operation.
Right. We're probably going to start with the virals, IBR, BVD, and then repeat those as they get a little bit closer to breeding, and then add in those bacterial causes of abortion. And it's really because some of these viruses can do two things. Two types of diseases. They can cause respiratory disease, and typically we think of that more around this weaning time. Yeah. And they can also cause abortions and pregnancy loss, which we, of course, typically think about when they're a little bit older and are pregnant.
So if you had your choice, when I'm weaning heifers, a lot of times I have them caught the day of weaning. So they've been on the cow. I haven't had a chance to catch them before. I've got them caught at the day of weaning. Would you start your vaccination program that day, or would you delay it? What would be your preference there?
You put me on the spot. My preference would probably be to delay it. But in reality, because of labor and facilities and things, a lot of times it is a lot easier to do it now, and I'm not totally opposed to that.
And why would you want to delay it?
And the reason I'd like to delay it is basically, again, we're talking about how well the animal responds immunologically, or how well she responds to that vaccine, is going to be best when her nutrition is stable, she's not stressed, nothing else is happening in her life, and she can really respond well. And that's not perfectly the day of weaning. Okay. And so I'd prefer to put it off a few, 2 or 3 weeks when she's well settled in, on a good plane of nutrition, kind of gotten over the weaning stress, and then vaccinate her then.
And depends quite a bit on what I think my exposure is going to be.
Yes.
Right? If I'm keeping them at home, not a big deal other than the labor issue to delay it for a while. If they're going to
I'm going to bring in a bunch
somewhere,
of heifers, then I'd probably get more interested in doing it right away.
So we want to try to set the time of the vaccines to build their immunity prior to when they're going to have a lot of exposure to disease, but knowing fully well the day that they're weaned and even the immediate time period afterwards, there's some stress going on, and stress releases cortisol, which is an immune suppressant, makes them not respond quite as well to vaccine as what they could have if they had.
Right. Which is one of the reasons to have a good conversation with your veterinarian. They really know your program and kind of some of the constraints that you're under, and can give you a best answer for you.
As we look at buying feeder calves this fall, so one of the questions that we've had is, should I buy feeder calves? What are some of my considerations? Or I'm planning to buy feeder calves. And as I sit here with both an economist and a veterinarian, great opportunity to ask, how do I think about that decision?
Well, for me, it's you put the pencil to the paper. I mean, you think about the feeds, what are the costs of the calves, when are you going to sell, et cetera. And there are a number of tools, decision support tools online that can help, whether like one I know that we tend to use quite a bit, or a colleague of mine uses quite a bit, is beefbasis.com, and you can type in, when you're buying, where you're selling, location-wise, and it'll tell you the value of the game. And so I think that's a pretty important one. And there are other decisions, Excel spreadsheet tools, whether you're looking at risk, et cetera, at agmanager.com, or probably other land-grant universities across the U.S. So that's, for me, it's going to be put the pencil to the paper and just really figure out, is it worth it?
So on beefbasis.com, what information would I expect to get from there? What would I look at?
Well,
are you talking prices? Or are you talking projected break-evens?
So you think about the projected break-evens. Okay, it's using a lot of futures and options or futures prices. You type in certain locations, it looks at the basis.
Yeah. So when I'm looking at the future, because I can often look at the futures board and see, here's what I expect the price of feeder calves to be, but I may be in central Nebraska or southeast Oklahoma, and my price may not be exactly the same, and there's a difference between my location and the board. And that's what the basis helps you look at.
That's called basis, and that basis is determined by a number of things, supply and demand locally.
Yep.
Or you can think about the transportation costs from that location to where the futures market would be.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think about when I work with clients today that are buying feeder calves, there's not one type of client. You've got feed yards that are relatively large feed yards. They're going to be buying quite a few weaned calves. You've also got some farmer feeders that are a little more flexible based on what they're going to do locally. And then a lot of guys that are going to basically buy these calves and then grow them over the winter or through the spring and then sell them as yearlings. And so you can't really fairly say there's one type of calf buyer out there. There's a lot of different types of calf buyers. And some of the guys I work with, how aggressively they're going to be in the market depends a lot on what feed they've got stocked up. So if they put up silage, now they have an idea of how much silage they have, and that really plays into how aggressively they're going to think about buying feeder calves, or if they've got wheat pasture or something to put them on. And then that changes from year to year how aggressively they really want to buy calves.
But having some flexibility in that system and being able to do the math on whether or not they come in makes sense.
Absolutely. Like I said, I think before you do anything, I think you turn to the tools. There are, on agmanager.info, we've got a wheat grazing tool. Should you graze wheat or not? We've got calf break-even price yearlings, tools, decision tools, and I think anything is you calculate those break-even before you jump in and make those purchases.
Yeah, absolutely, especially with the volatility as the market changes, and you know some of your costs, but the calf cost is one of the big drivers of profitability. So calf cost and what I think I could sell him for, and doing the math on that makes sense. So one more question, and Bob, I want to address you for this one. As we're thinking about preg-check this time of year, and I'll give you a scenario.
Okay.
We get a pregnant cow in the chute, and she's pregnant, but she is also 14 years old. Keeper, color.
So that's a good, hard question. In general, my bias is if she's pregnant, I'm going to keep her. But I'll also say that I may look at her a lot closer in that as a 14-year-old, she's more likely to maybe, not have the teeth that she needs to really maintain her body weight. She may have had mastitis in the past, may not have the udder quality. So I'm probably going to judge her a lot more harshly than I would a younger cow.
But she's pregnant.
That is true, which is why I'm even considering her at all. All right, the fact that she's pregnant certainly puts a plus on the plus and minus calculator. But the minus is because she's 14, I need her to thrive all the way till a year from now when we wean her calf. And so my judgment really is, yes, she's pregnant, which is necessary, but is she still going to be taking good care of that calf a year from now? And that becomes my decision. And that's why I'm looking at feet, legs, mouth, udder, those types of things. And I might occasionally sell a pregnant cow if I really don't think she's going to thrive from now till a year from now.
Yeah. And I'll mostly agree with you, although there's no way to know. We don't have a crystal ball and we're standing by the chute, so most of the time in that case, I'll err on the side of if she looks good and she's in good shape, I'm going to keep her.
Basically, the way I'm going to decide is if this seems to be working for me the last few years, I'll keep her. If I can remember a cow last year that I should have sold, then I'll sell her. So totally, non-data-based, emotionally driven decision.
You could keep some records.
I mean,
so an idea would be to tag your cows and keep some records. I don't want to push you too far into the future, but
that's a good point because there's some geography differences too. Because in different geographic areas, depending on the types of forages, the type of land that they're grazing, let's back it off a little bit. A 12 or 13-year-old cow may have very good likelihood of doing well for the next couple of years.
Yeah.
And in another geographic area, that's really pushing the border of what we expect those cows to do. So I agree. Knowing what is expected for your herd in your area helps that decision a lot.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Bob Larson. The entire Cattle Chat podcast and instructions on how to subscribe to that podcast can be found at beefcattleinstitute.org. Beefcattleinstitute, all one word, .org. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today from the campus of Kansas State University. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Over now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The new North American Free Trade Agreement, once it's ratified, will provide a bump in U.S. agricultural exports. However, an analysis released yesterday by the Farm Foundation shows those trade gains are overwhelmed by lost exports due to retaliatory tariffs. Farm Foundation contracted with economists at Purdue University to estimate the impacts on U.S. agriculture from the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, or USMCA. The study contrasted the agreement with its predecessor, NAFTA. This analysis says that the USMCA is hindered by retaliatory tariffs Canada and Mexico initiated against U.S. farmers after the Trump administration raised tariffs on Canadian and Mexican steel and aluminum. Those tariffs will bring down U.S. agriculture exports by $1.8 billion, says this study. Once Chinese tariffs are added in, U.S. agriculture exports could fall $7.9 billion, it says, thus overwhelming the small positive gains from USMCA. Oilseed exports show the sharpest decline at 21%, while meat products drop by nearly 9%. As of now, there's no direction from the Trump administration on what may cause the U.S. to remove the steel and aluminum tariffs, or whether they would remain after the USMCA is ratified. The Farm Foundation report states that once the USMCA is ratified, the new trade deal should bring a sigh of relief to U.S. farmers, as the Foundation report reads. It notes that NAFTA boosted U.S. export shares into Canada and Mexico from 14% roughly 25 years ago to 30% now. This new trade agreement maintains free market access for agriculture while improving access to Canada for dairy and poultry exports. In dollar figures, dairy exports could increase to $280 million, while exports of some meat or livestock products, mainly poultry, could go up $210 million. Those are the major areas where market access will grow, says the report. Impacts on other agricultural sectors would be relatively modest. Now, for the U.S. to return to the trade negotiating table with China, one high-ranking USDA official says there would have to be positive movement by China on two key issues. The USDA's Gary Crawford reports.
The trade dispute with China continues on, and the tariffs continue. U.S. Undersecretary of Agriculture Ted McKinney, on a trade mission in southern Africa, told U.S. reporters that for the U.S. to come to the negotiating table with China,
we need two basic things. There might be a few others, but at the core, we need two things. One, quit stealing our intellectual property, our products, and the things that go with that.
This week, an example of that, federal authorities charging two Chinese intelligence officers and a team of hackers with stealing U.S. and French airplane technology. McKinney says the second thing the U.S. wants before negotiations can really begin:
quit forcing technology transfer for our companies that you all invite in and then force technology transfer.
McKinney said if China takes some positive actions on those two issues, his sense of it is
we're going to have an opportunity to get back to the table, or at least that's my strong hope.
And the strong hope of U.S. farmers who have been hurt the most from the U.S.-China trade dispute. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
The Environmental Protection Agency has proposed a rule that, if finalized, would provide the livestock industry regulatory relief from burdensome reporting requirements. Todd Domer reports.
Acting EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler was in Kansas City this week to sign a rule amending emergency release notification regulations under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA, to clarify the reporting of air emissions from livestock operations is not required. EPCRA was enacted to ensure sources emitting hazardous chemicals report to local emergency responders to allow for more effective planning for chemical emergencies. The law was never intended by Congress to apply to ag operations. Emergency responders did not see the value in collecting thousands of reports from farmers and ranchers due to the diffuse emissions from livestock operations that pose little threat to public health or the environment and do not relate to any particular chemical event. The proposed rule reflects EPA's interpretation that, based on the government's reporting requirements, Air emissions from farms and ranches do not need to be reported under EPCRA. I'm Todd Domer.
And you're listening to Agriculture Today. Now, this week's Kansas soybean update for you. Here's Greg Akagi.
Jennifer Greenstein is joining us. She serves as the co-chair of the Next Generation Scientist for Biodiesel program, which is managed by the National Biodiesel Board. And Jennifer, what is the objective of this program?
The objective of the Next Generation Scientist for Biodiesel program is to foster relationships between students and professionals that work in the biodiesel field. So we focus a lot on collaboration, networking, and career development.
Jennifer, you're a doctoral candidate at North Carolina State University in plant and microbiology, and your research on that specifically is focused on biodiesel.
I'm a PhD student at NC State University, and I began this program actually working in enzymatic biodiesel, so I was working on an alternative approach to produce biodiesel, and I saw that using immobilized enzymes worked a lot better for us than using soluble enzymes. So I thought it'd be really cool if I took that enzyme and used it to another piece that would enable immobilization in one easy step. So that would provide an alternative catalyst for biodiesel production.
Why is it important to have a cooperation like this between universities and the biodiesel industry?
It's very important for an organization like this to exist because students can become very isolated in the academic world and never talk to professionals. So it's really good for students to see what kind of jobs are out there, to meet people, hear what they have to say, see what types of things the industry is interested in. And it's also great for people in industry to meet students so they can see all the types of research that they're doing.
And if there are students who have an interest in joining the Next Generation Scientist for Biodiesel program, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, that would be great. For students to join the Next Generation Scientist for Biodiesel program, just visit biodieselsustainability.com and go over to the student tab, and the application is right there. It is free and just takes minutes to join. And then you receive all sorts of updates and emails and information about webinars and invites to apply to a travel scholarship for the conference.
All right, Jennifer, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much.
That is Jennifer Greenstein, who serves as the co-chair of the Next Generation Scientist for Biodiesel program, which is managed by the National Biodiesel Board. She joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Many thanks, Greg. And we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Agriculture Today returns now, and it is our weekly K-State horticulture segment for you. And homeowners, yes, there are a few things to tie off yet in terms of your lawn management to finish out this growing season. We'll get into those right now with K-State Research and Extension turfgrass horticulturist Jared Hoyle. And Jared, one of the things that's on the minds of folks right now, especially with the rainfall we've had this past month or so, the explosion of weeds in our yards. And do we still have time to deal with those?
Yes, that's correct. With it getting a little cooler, we're not seeing as many of the summer annual weeds have died off with the frost, but we're starting to see some chickweed and henbit, some of these winter annual weeds starting to pop up with the rains, and even maybe a little residual dandelion here or there that may have stuck through the summertime or didn't get killed with the earlier application. They're starting to pop in the lawns, and so now is a good time to go out with a broadleaf herbicide and get them before it gets too cold.
And we still have a fairly decent window of time to pull this off, right? Up until the next freeze? What?
Yes, I think you still got a pretty good amount of time, just especially with one of those warmer days. You can go out and spray them. Make sure that if you did overseed a cool season lawn that you've mown it the correct amount of times, or it's the amount of days recommended on the label that has been emerged from the lawn so you don't injure any newly seeded stuff. But you do have still a good amount of time. Before it gets cold, really cold again, you'll be okay.
And as far as product selection goes, there are several options that'll work. Right?
There are several options out there. Any of those three-way selectives that have multiple synthetic auxin herbicides in it work really well on like the chickweed and henbit. And it's the optimal time for dandelion in the fall, too.
And one can treat some of these weeds in the spring, but fall application really gives you a leg up on these, right?
It does. It gives you a leg up. You don't have to deal with it in the spring, and you don't have to look at them all winter either.
Right. So as our weather remains relatively warm, get out there and put down that last herbicide treatment of the season on those late emerging weeds. And speaking of which, for those with fescue lawns, they might want to be thinking about the final fertilization of the fall, too, you say.
That's correct. We call this a winterizer fertilizer application, but there's nothing in particular special about it. It is just the final application right before the fescue goes dormant. It helps hold that green color in it. You definitely want to use a quick release source, not a slow release, because you want the plant to use it up and store it now before going into winter, where if you used a slow release, it'd be releasing through the winter and the plant wouldn't be taken up. So this will be the last application that you would be going out with right about now, October, November, and that'll really hold the green color in the fescue lawn throughout the wintertime.
You mentioned a quick release product here. What if one wanted to go the weed and feed route? Do we find products that will suit this need?
There are products out there that are weed and feed. I would recommend looking at the rate on that product to make sure that if you're applying the weed and feed or the herbicide rate, that you're getting the enough nitrogen that you need to put down. And vice versa, if you put enough nitrogen down, are you getting enough weed and feed? They are good, but just make sure that that ratio is right so you can get that herbicide rate correct and that nitrogen rate correct.
And speaking of nitrogen rate, any standard number to go by there?
Well, for fescue, we're looking at 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet for the total fall application. So right now, if you've done your earlier applications, maybe you did a pound, now would be, your last pound of a quick release you would put out. Maybe you didn't get out earlier and you did 1.5 pounds. Still stick to that 1 pound because we're closing in on that window where that fescue is not going to be absorbing much more. So if you apply more, you're not going to get much more out of it anyway. So right now, 1 pound would be really good to finish out the season of actual nitrogen.
But the total for the season, for the fall, 3 pounds per 1,000.
3 pounds would have been September, October, November-ish. Yep.
And folks now are cleaning up their yards or have begun that process because the leaves are dropping around our Kansas landscapes. You have always advocated, Jared, utilizing that organic material in a positive way for your lawn management as well as your ornamentals, likewise.
Yes, so the leaves are falling nonstop. If you can mulch those leaves with your mulching mower or side discharge and leave them on the lawn, it's not going to hurt your turf whatsoever. If you end up having an abundance of leaves, it may be needed to pick some of them up, but you can utilize them maybe in your garden or your compost pile. Just try not to blow them in the street. Don't let them go down the sewer drain, but utilize it as much as you can. Sometimes it's easier just to blow them in a pile, mulch them up, and then maybe suck up some what you can. You're not going to get all of it, but then the small pieces fall down to the surface. There has been some information out there that suggests if you do mulch, it helps with some weed control, but it's not been proven. It's all anecdotal evidence, but at least it's there and it helps out with the soil. It helps maybe shade some of those bare areas so you don't get more henbit or chickweed coming in. But it's a lot easier to mulch it than it is to pick them and bag them and haul them away, too.
And does it lend to the organic makeup of the turf that's supporting your grass?
It will, just because it is a plant product. It's going to contain those same nutrients and stuff that leaf clippings would, so you're going to add it right back into your soil.
And about any mulching blade will take care of it. You want that material to be relatively fine when you're done, don't you?
As best as you can. Now, you don't want to have to worry too much about going over 4 or 5 times, but as best as you can, and it doesn't have to be too thin. And it's okay that not every one of the leaves are completely mulched up and it's completely green lawn at that time. You can leave a little bit on it and they'll fall in, and as you mow over it, they'll crush themselves as well. And walk over them, those leaves will just kind of disintegrate on their own.
It's a great and handy and obviously affordable organic source for your turf grass by just simply mulching those leaves. So we'll be heading into the winter, and if folks follow these basic steps, their lawn ought to be all set for the ultimate change in the weather.
That is correct. It's a good time to put your lawn to sleep, so to say, and do the maintenance on your lawnmower and your oil changes and get it ready and put it up so it's ready to go for next year as well.
Jared, thank you, as always, for coming over.
Thank you.
Turfgrass specialist, K-State Research and Extension, that's Jared Hoyle, with a handful of things that you homeowners can carry out in, as he says, winterizing your turfgrass for another dormant season. And that is this week's K-State Horticulture segment. As we wrap up today's edition, this reminder: you can subscribe to the podcast of our regular broadcasts by simply going to this website, agtoday.net. You can listen on demand there, and you can find links to subscribe via the various podcast apps. Once more, agtoday, all one word, .net. Meantime, thanks for tuning in right here. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.